At the center of everything, there is a lamb, slaughtered but living, with scars that endure, swallowed by death, but defiantly risen. In spite of our misguided wishing for lions, and over against all imperial decrees, rise the songs of resistance, the anthems of praise, to the Lamb who is love at the center of everything. Around him are gathered innumerable faces of each color and gender and nation and tongue, and to him pledge allegiance, in him shape their lives, for they trust in God's reign as old systems give way. At the center of everything, here stands the Lamb, and at the end of everything, there comes a new beginning. Welcome to the second episode of our video companion series to our fall Bible study, Lamb Power, taking a look at the book of Revelation in the New Testament and trying to make sense of where there's good news for us as we listen to what this book first meant to its original hearers and then what it means for us reading it centuries later. And in our first session, we took a really broad look at how this book works, and things that will hopefully be helpful tools for us as we read through the book of Revelation. We talked about how the same way we have everyday skills we use all the time to understand the images and symbols that are thrown at us all the time in life, we can use those same skills to take a look at a book that sometimes seems really complicated and sometimes seems so loaded with layers of meaning and complicated symbols we don't even try, right? It feels like it's trying to see through fog. Well, okay, we've got tools for seeing through fog in our day. You slow down, you turn on the right kind of headlights, you don't turn the blaring high beams on because that'll make it worse, but you find the right tools so you can make your way through the fog. So, we've tried to do the same thing here in this study. And finally, we're going to actually be getting into the content of the book of Revelation. Our video companion series is going to still have a kind of broad feel because we're inviting you to join us in person where you're able for our gatherings on Tuesday evenings at 7 o'clock held up at New Life Lutheran Church, but also with additional supplemental handouts and study materials as well. So if you're interested and this whets your appetite, be in touch with us. We'll get you additional materials for a deeper dive. Now, to get into the opening piece of the book of Revelation, today in this second session, we're going to cover material that's in Revelation chapters 1 through 3. Again, remembering that those chapter divisions are our later invention because it's one of those tools that helps us navigate better. Instead of somebody saying, hey, you know that part where there are those 7 letters? It's easier to say, hey, let's call that a natural division. Let's call that the beginning of chapter 2. So we're going to cover the introduction that sets the stage for all of the book of Revelation in chapter 1, and then work our way through 7 letters to actual congregations that existed in what today we call Turkey, but would have then been called Asia Minor back in the 1st century, that are in the 2nd and 3rd chapters of the book of Revelation. Okay, so before we jump back 2,000 years to the 1st century and the book of Revelation, let's take an earlier stop to a piece of literature that I think could be helpful from just a few decades ago, 50, 60 years ago, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote the letter from Birmingham City Jail. I know this might seem like one of those, wait a second, I thought we were studying the Bible here kind of moments. I'm hoping this will be helpful, and as we keep saying in this series, this will all make sense in the end. What Dr. King does in the famous letter from Birmingham City Jail is write an open letter to people who are critics of his, but also knowing that people who were supporters of his movement would find encouragement from what he wrote, and that they would understand the logic to why he was approaching things the way they did. And I think something very similar to that is going on in the opening chapters of the book of Revelation, where we have not 1 but 7 open letters written to other actual historical congregations in Asia Minor, in modern-day Turkey, that we're living with. How do we live in a world where it seems like the powers of evil are around us all the time without giving in to evil and also not getting crushed by it? So, quick summary of what Dr. King's letter to from the Birmingham City Jail has to say and how it works. King had been arrested for a peaceful protest of segregation-era laws and Jim Crow laws in Birmingham, Alabama. Part of his group had been invited by local leaders to lead this demonstration. They get arrested. There he is sitting in jail, and while he had been arrested, some local, I will be charitable and say well-meaning pastors wrote to King criticizing him, saying that it was wrong of him to lead a nonviolent, peaceful protest through the streets because that was going to agitate people too much. He'd be seen as an extremist, and he just should accommodate. He should walk more slowly and hope that things got better on their own. But they sure hoped that things would get better in race relations. They sure hoped that segregation would end, but that he should just sort of like let that take a backseat and hope everything all works out. King wrote a response that we now call the letter from Birmingham City Jail that was meant both to address his critics and to call them to change. He doesn't give up hope on them. He says he sort of writes with the hope that they might see the wisdom of his thinking and change their actions, and also writing to his supporters, knowing that they will be reading this open letter with the thought that this would encourage them and confirm them in the project they were about, the nonviolent resistance to segregation, to make change, because as King was convinced, that was an important implication of what it means to be the followers of God, to be followers of Jesus, in his case as a Christian pastor, but to be part of what the beloved community looks like. And in the course of writing this letter, King does a couple of important things. He makes some important moves. He says, if you're living in a situation that you are convinced is rotten, is unjust, is unrighteous, and certainly is not God's will, God's intention, and he would have said segregation and Jim Crow South America, that wasn't what God's intention was supposed to be. That was the fundamental way that society operated there, keeping people separate and giving second-hand, second-class kinds of things and status to African American people in the United States. That was wrong, right? So King says, if we're going to live in that, if we have to live in that kind of setting, one, you have to be able to resist or speak out against it. You don't just put your head in the sand or hope it goes away or say, I feel bad for people who have to live under that. You have to address it. Speak out against it. You resist it. You don't reinforce that or continue to make it worse. On the other hand, King makes it clear he's there to refuse to play by the rules that evil wants to play by. Powerful empires, powerful systems, when they get corrupted by sin, have a way of only using force and coercion and manipulation to get their way. So whether it was, we'll turn the police dogs and the fire hoses on you, or we'll firebomb your church, or threaten your life, that was the threat of using violence to try and silence King's movement. And King says, we're not going to do that back. Our calling, our goal, is to transform everybody so that nobody has to live in this bad system that turned out to be bad for everybody that was the Jim Crow South. So we're not going to play by evil's rules. We're not going to ignore the situation, and we can't just sit on the fence and hope things go away because that's more comfortable. He makes a strong case for why we can't just ignore the problem and hope it goes away, and that you can't just sit on the fence. At some point, you're called to action. And then finally, King says his movement is about persisting, but through a different strategy than violence or demonizing their opponent. The strategy was persistent love and truth-telling. So in other words, they'd keep telling the truth. It's not right. It's not just to have, some water fountains labeled colored and some white. It wasn't just to have good stuff for some citizens and bad things for other citizens. That wasn't right. That wasn't just. To keep telling the truth, but to be willing to pay the price, to be willing to be the one thrown in jail or beaten with the police clubs or have the dogs thrown at you, to be willing to bear that rather than to attack their enemies with violence. That's an important part of King's movement. In other words, we will continue being faithful witnesses to the truth we have to tell, but we'll do it with love rather than with violence or domination or manipulation or coercion. That's a lot to accomplish. And King's letter from Birmingham Jail is fantastic, really powerful, dense, but important reading. If you've never read it, we'll put a link on the web at the end of this video and in the comments so that you can make sure to get access to read this as well on your own. But that, in a nutshell, is what this document, the letter from Birmingham City Jail, is supposed to be about. And I want to suggest that something similar is what the writer of Revelation, John on Patmos, is doing in the opening 3 chapters, and in a sense with the whole book that he's written. The book of Revelation begins with a man who introduces himself by the name of John. It's hard to tell. Are we talking about the same John who's one of the original followers of Jesus, or who we associate with the gospel according to John, or the letters 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John? Really hard to know, because John's a common name. It still is in American culture, so hard to know if you got somebody who's only going by a first name, that there could have been many people with that name who were leaders in the early church. There's some kinds of language that's similar between the book of Revelation and, say, the Gospel of John. But again, that's hard to know. If I took a survey of people's Christmas sermons across the country, there might be a lot that talk about mangers and Jesus and use the phrase joy to the world, but it doesn't mean the same one person wrote all of them. There's going to be some common themes. All we know is that this is somebody who is an early leader in the church, probably who had centered his work in Asia Minor, and that his name is John. He gets this vision of Jesus, and Jesus is addressing him while he's in exile on an island called Patmos. Again, likely then that he's suffering for having been a follower of Jesus and a leader in the movement of the followers of Jesus. So his setting isn't all that different from Dr. King sitting in the Birmingham jail, right? He's already borne some suffering for his faith and for being a part of the movement that was the followers of Jesus. And now, knowing that he's behind bars or in exile, how is he going to continue to support and help and encourage the movement that he had left behind when he was arrested, but then also maybe give redirection where he thinks that people he's writing to need redirection. So he writes letters. And Jesus, in the vision that he's given, tells him, go write letters to the 7 churches that are in Asia Minor. And these are actual historical congregations that would have been there, quite possibly meeting in people's house churches, whether small buildings or sort of a larger house that someone in the community who'd converted to Christianity lived in and then opened up for followers of Jesus to meet in, but still pretty small, not that organized, but enough that these are viable congregations that have been around for at least some time. The letters have a recurring formula to them, and that's something we'll explore more in depth in our study series itself. But something to note is about how all the letters work, all 7 of them, again, written to actual congregations, and in those letters, we get the voice of Jesus, and John, our narrator, is sort of writing down, here's what Jesus says to this congregation, this congregation, this congregation, that kind of thing. And in the recurring pattern, there seems to be both a call for change, right? Where that congregation is off track, the voice of Jesus says, here's what you're doing that's wrong. I need you to get on track this way. So change what you're doing in this area or this area or this area. And then Jesus will also say, here's what you're doing that's good. Thank you. Keep doing that. And then by the end of each of the letters, there's sort of this open-ended promise. And the recurring phrasing is, to the one who overcomes, or sometimes it's translated, to the one who conquers, I will give, and there's this sort of promise from Jesus. In other words, continue, be persistent, be faithful, endure, and there's good waiting for you. I know you're suffering right now, but eventually there will be this victory that's achieved. The question, though, is, what does it mean to overcome? See, if you hear the verse in the Bible, to the one who conquers, I will give a crown, that kind of sounds like Jesus is inviting his followers to go raise up an army and go conquering other countries. It sort of seems like John is setting the table and that he's going to fill in that idea of what does it really mean to conquer, to overcome, as we go through the book of Revelation as a whole. Because we're going to discover by the end, there's a very particular way that the followers of Jesus conquer or overcome. And it's not through violence or domination or raising up armies or killing other people. It's through faithful witness. In other words, it's continuing to, in our words and in our actions, echo the way of Jesus. Because Jesus, it turns out, has already won the victory. Our calling is to witness to what Jesus has done in our words and in our actions. That might be helpful then to know that when the book of Revelation in these 7 letters uses the phrase to the one who overcomes or the one who conquers, it's the same verb that Paul will use in Romans when he says, don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That overcoming is the same word sometimes translated conquer in the book of Revelation. In other words, it's not that we're supposed to raise up an army or get an angry mob and take over because we think we should be in charge and we'll kill the people who we don't agree with. But rather, our way of overcoming evil is not to participate in evil or play by its rules, right? Empires know how to kill, and so they want to goad us into fighting back on their terms. The followers of Jesus have always been called, don't play by evil's rules, that lets evil win. Overcome by refusing to play by evil's rules, overcome evil with good. While those words come from Paul in the book of Romans, that same idea that we'll overcome as Christians, but our way of doing it is through good and a willingness to suffer for the sake of others, and as we continue to tell the truth and embody the truth we've seen in Jesus. That's different than the way the world usually hears conquering. Conquering is we'll send in the armies and we'll destroy and we'll kill and we'll blow things up, and that's how we'll win. The followers of Jesus in the book of Revelation, a lot like Dr. King's supporters as part of the movement that was the civil rights movement. Their response is our way of overcoming, our way that victory will be achieved, isn't through killing our enemies, but to change our enemies into friends and into allies. As they watch and listen to what we do, as they see our willingness to suffer for what we're doing rather than harming somebody else, that gives us a power that other people aren't going to be able to deny. And eventually, justice will win the day. Eventually, the truth will out. Our way of responding to evil has a lot to do with refusing to play by evil's terms. And so I want to suggest the book of Revelation suggests not quietism, not that we just sort of ignore and hope things get better, but also that we're not called to take up arms ourselves, but this very different kind of middle ground. Our way of participating in God's victory is pointing to Jesus in our words and in our actions. So, for the writer of Revelation, he's calling these actual real-life congregations, these real-life churches, to find that space. It's not a middle ground, but it's sort of a tension. It's call out the evil that's all around you and refuse to participate in it. And when Caesar insists that you worship him, refuse to. And when you see people using violence and domination and injustice, don't be a part of it. Resist it. But on the other hand, our way of resisting is we'll be the ones being willing to be thrown in jail or suffering for our faith. We're not going to harm other people as a way of living out our faith. Now, a couple other things to know. In the 7 letters that make up Revelation chapter 2 and 3, there are sometimes some very specific people and situations that are named that it's hard for us to exactly track down what is being talked about here. From time to time, the writer will talk about teachings that were emerging, groups called the Nicolaitans, for example, or he refers to a false teacher who he doesn't like in another church and says, don't listen to her. It's hard to be sure what these teachers were teaching. We can only sort of get half of the conversation, obviously, and maybe our guesses from what other early voices in the church and in church history have said. But without knowing all those details, we can get the broad brushstrokes of when you are dealing with difficult circumstances, hostility from the outside and tension on the inside, our way of dealing with it will be to overcome, in Paul's words, to overcome evil with good. We won't respond to evil by playing by evil's rules. We'll respond with goodness, with suffering love, with truth-telling, with echoing the way of Jesus. When you're holding on to Jesus, you can be clear about what you're doing and clear about where you're supposed to go. In a way kind of similar, if I read a letter from Birmingham Jail, it's real easy to get lost in the particular names and historical figures he references that were current in his time that I don't know all the depth of. I can do some research on and figure out, oh, this reference to Bull Connor means this, or this reference to the 1954 Board of Education Supreme Court decision means this. I can get some of that background, but I don't live in 1963, and so I'm not called to fight this particular battle anymore, but reading this letter that is now more than half a century old can certainly inspire and challenge me to how do I live my life, practicing the faith of Jesus, living in the way of Jesus, so that I can be a faithful witness in the situations I face. I think we read the book of Revelation the same way. We can't put ourselves exactly in what was going on in the first century, and we don't have to, right? A lot of the issues the early church was wrestling with are ones we don't have to wrestle with anymore. It is not a live question anymore, whether you do or don't eat meat sacrificed to idols in a temple in your local marketplace anymore. That's not an issue for us anymore. So when I read that happening in Revelation 2 and 3, I can go, okay, good. This was an example of an issue that was an issue for them back in the first century. What might this mean as I look at situations in front of me today? and to read the book of Revelation that way. What was going on in the first century? What are things that are applicable to the situation I find myself living in? And then from there, how do I live faithfully as a follower of Jesus right where I am? Knowing that my way of participating in God's victory, and that's it, it's God's victory, not mine. The way to participate in God's victory is simply being a faithful witness to Jesus, so that when other people look at my words and my actions, they go, yeah, I see a glimpse of Jesus in that person. I want to be a part of what they're up to. It doesn't have anything to do with culture wars or getting political power, or certainly not raising up an army or an angry mob. None of that. But people who change the world by our faithful witness. It all calls to mind one of my favorite passages that I'll offer as a closing to this video session here. A closing passage from Dr. King's letter from Birmingham City Jail. And in so many ways, this feels to me very much in the same spirit of what John the seer from the island of Patmos is doing in the first 3 chapters of Revelation. King says this: I gradually gained a bit of satisfaction by being considered an extremist. Others were calling King an extremist. Was not Jesus an extremist in love? Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, pray for those who despitefully use you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the gospel of Jesus Christ? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God. Was not John Bunyan an extremist? I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. Was not Abraham Lincoln an extremist? This nation cannot survive half slave and half free. And then he goes on to say this. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate, or will we be extremists for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice, or will we be extremists for the cause of justice? In that dramatic scene on Calvary's Hill, 3 men were crucified. We must not forget that all 3 were crucified for the same crime, the crime of extremism. 2 were extremists for immorality and thus fell below their environment. The other, Jesus Christ, was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness, and thereby rose above his environment. So, after all, maybe the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. Every time I read those words, it brings me up short. It convicts me, and it encourages me. The places where I become complacent, I feel like I've gotten kicked in the rear again. And how do we live out this faith? How can I be an extremist for love? And at the same time, I find myself encouraged. Yeah, that's what we're supposed to be about. That's what I want to spend my life on. The opening chapters of the book of Revelation are meant to do much the same. To offer all of us, people who'd become complacent 2,000 years ago and in the 21st century, both encouragement to keep on going, and also to shake us up in the places where we become complacent, both at the same time, so that in a sense, we can be extremists for love. Peoples whose way of calling out the rottenness in the world and pointing to something different is to embody the way of Jesus in what we do and what we say. So, I invite you to join us, if you can, in person to our gathering coming up on Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock at New Life Church. If not, to join us continued by these video companion sessions as well. Bring your thoughts, insights, questions, or whatever. If you have a chance, read Dr. King's letter from Birmingham City Jail as you also mull over chapters 1 through 3 of Revelation. And we hope you join us next time here on Lamb Power.